Elizabeth was memorialised first as the young woman coming to the throne in a blaze of glory and optimism, then as a woman devoted to duty, and finally as the nation's grandmother in bright colours equipped with an ever-present handbag. Welcome to the first episode of this History Extra Academy series exploring the lives of some of history's most remarkable queens. I'm Professor Kate Williams, and in this episode, we'll consider how Elizabeth II harnessed the technology and changing society of the 20th century to transform her image from a young woman considered unready for the throne to a monarch who dutifully reigned through decades of extraordinary social and political change. The future Queen Elizabeth II was born just before the general strike of 1926. The then Home Secretary, William Joynson Hicks, had to leave discussions about the effects of the strike to assent to her legitimacy, a tradition that dated back to the 17th century, ever since an event known as the warming pan baby fiasco. This controversy saw a pretty vicious rumour circulate which claimed that a boy baby born to King James VII II and his queen, Mary of Modena, in 1688 was non-existent. Maybe the pregnancy had been faked with a fake bump and replaced by another child smuggled into the birth chamber in a warming pan, a 17th century hot water bottle. Almost 2.5 centuries later, when Elizabeth Windsor was born, the same official approval was still needed. Elizabeth was born a minor royal, the first child of the Duke and Duchess of York. As her mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, Duchess of York, put it, she hoped that her two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, would simply have a life of happy marriages and happy memories. But even though in 1926 Elizabeth was seen as a more irrelevant royal, as a baby she was quickly used as a PR weapon. Images of her were sold across Britain and beyond. In fact, she was dubbed the world's best-known baby. But all of this changed for the world's best-known baby in 1936, when Elizabeth's uncle, King Edward VIII, abdicated. Suddenly, at the age of 10, she was heir to the throne. As her governess related it, she was surprised, but did not show it. The young Elizabeth continuing to write up her notes from her swimming lessons and simply putting abdication day at the top of the paper. When Elizabeth came to the throne in 1952, following the death of her father, King George VI, she was underestimated because she was young and female. Winston Churchill, then serving his second term as Prime Minister, declared her only a child, even though she was 25 and a mother of 2. Churchill's private secretary, who'd previously served the royal family, tried to console him that he'd find the new monarch charming, intelligent, conscientious. In other words, it would be fine because she was attractive and hard-working. And, meanwhile, medical journal The Lancet published an article that suggested that as a mother of 2 small children, the job of queen was really beyond Elizabeth's capabilities and she should step back until she was older. The 1950s were a man's world. Women had been sent back to the home after World War II, and if women worked, they were expected to give up on marriage. Yet, even though Elizabeth proved her skill and proved people wrong, her looks would still often be cited as her strength. Winston Churchill later declared that no movie star could have played the role better. Again, it was all about her appearance. As he put it, all the film people in the world, if they'd scoured the globe, could not have found anyone so suited to the part.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
In the televised broadcast of her June 1953 coronation, Elizabeth was dazzling. Her image was beamed into homes, and non-stop flights took her footage across the Atlantic. The news that Mount Everest had been conquered by Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay on the 29th of May as part of a British coordinated expedition was held back to coincide with the coronation, so it would seem like a double triumph for the nation. As Princess Margaret put it, the coronation was like a phoenix time. Everything was being raised from the ashes. There was nothing to stop anything getting better and better. The image of Elizabeth as queen was presented to a country where women could not sign for their own credit card or mortgage. Their working for a wage was feared, unequal pay was legal, there was no maternity leave, and rights within marriage were much reduced. And in terms of the economy, the truth was it wasn't a phoenix time. Britain was in a post-war decline. But her coronation created a fever dream of female royalty on TV that has proved all-pervasive. Television has been particularly helpful to royals since the mid-20th century. In the past, caricaturists could draw Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, and she could only counter these assaults on her image by commissioning portraits. With the advent of television, there could still be mockery and imitations, but only the real royal could provide access to the moving image, the real image. Elizabeth II used television so effectively to counter criticism and low popularity, such as at the time of the death of Princess Diana in 1997, when she famously broadcast and addressed the nation as a grandmother.
What I say to you now, as your queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself.
Elizabeth often addressed the nation on television in times of national crisis, and there's just one of these we'll zoom in on today, and that was in 1983. In 1983, at the height of the fear of nuclear weapons, a speech was written for the Queen, who had then been 30 years on the throne, to deliver in the event of nuclear war, or, as they viewed it then, World War III. And Elizabeth's speech was recently released by the National Archives, and she talked about the comparisons between World War III and World War II. As she was to say, "Now this madness of war is once more spreading through the world, and our brave country must again prepare itself to survive against great odds. I have never forgotten the sorrow and the pride I felt as my sister and I huddled around the nursery wireless set, listening to my father's inspiring words on that fateful day in 1939. Not for a single moment did I imagine that this solemn and awful duty would one day fall to me. We all know that the dangers facing us today are greater by far than at any time in our long history. The enemy is not the soldier with his rifle, nor even the airman prowling the skies above our cities and towns, but the deadly power of abused technology." Elizabeth, in the speech, could not offer much practical advice, but she instead encouraged families to remain united and offer shelter to those living alone. Files from the National Archives estimated that 33 million people would die in the event of nuclear attacks, 1 million in London alone, and predictions were made that the urban populations would flee to the countryside, massive anti-war demonstrations would take place, and hospitals would be looted for medical supplies. There were comparatively few bunkers for the population, and ordinary people would have to take their chances with deadly weapons, mass deaths, and shortages. One wonders if there were further plans to ask the Queen to keep speaking to the nation after an attack, to tell people to have courage and pull together. I imagine so. There were strict plans made of how to protect the Queen in the event of a nuclear war, including using the royal yacht or in a nuclear bunker in London or Windsor. These are very important, according to the documents in the 1983 file, because in the case of the Prime Minister's death, the Queen would have to appoint a replacement. I mean, one might suggest that if over 30 million were killed and hospitals being looted, a Prime Minister could be appointed without the Queen's involvement. But still, even in times of such extreme crisis, the government made plans for constitutional traditions to continue, as enabled by monarchy. In the 1980s, the government believed that in the event of nuclear war, people would turn on their televisions to watch the Queen. Nowadays, if we hear about a possibility of danger, we rush to social media for the latest. But I hazard we would still expect an address from the monarch as well as our world leaders. So television and Elizabeth II became so indelibly linked that she would address the nation on the event of World War III. Televisions proved a useful tool for the monarchy to wield, but it wasn't always the case. Elizabeth II was the queen of television, but it was a double-edged sword. Royals are only private in the womb, said her governess when she was a princess, Marion Crawford. This was a striking comment, considering she said it in the 1930s. When the BBC documentary The Royal Family was transmitted in 1969, it was watched by nearly 23 million viewers in the UK, with a global estimated audience of 350 million. Some say more than watched the men landing on the moon. It showed, as well as the Queen attending engagements, her buying an ice cream for Prince Edward and the royal family enjoying a barbecue and eating breakfast. But by the 1970s, the documentary had been locked away. It had let in too much light on the subjects. Elizabeth and the royal family found that, unlike portrait painting, the royal image communicated through TV and today, streaming and social media could not and cannot always be controlled. This has been perhaps no more thoroughly proven than by the stark image broadcast around the world in early 2026 of Elizabeth's third child, Andrew, driven away from a police station, and this may be one of the enduring images of royal reputation in the 2020s. Elizabeth had promised when still a princess, before she came to the throne, that her whole life would be devoted to your service. This became her mantra, and indeed one of her very last communications with the country at her Platinum Jubilee was signed, "Your servant." If Queen Elizabeth I said, "I see," and stay silent, Elizabeth II's attitude was very similar, saying little, focusing on duty. This notion of constitutional monarchy intersected with what clearly was acceptable in the 1950s and beyond of a woman in power: judicious, thoughtful, and also silence. And for Elizabeth, I would argue that her greatest legacy was her state visits, the most travelled monarch in history, travelling almost 42 times around the world. These visits were her efforts in diplomacy, in soft power, to bolster peaceful relations after the painful memories of World War II. She always was a war baby, always really determined to avoid such horror again. And the pre-existing notion that a monarch stays out of politics was really, I think, sort of emphasised by this idea that the monarch should say little, and that has stuck as pretty much the job description of a monarch. And her greatest legacy, I might say, is safeguarding constitutional monarchy, surrounded by the idea that it's not just about advising and warning, but also knowing when to stay silent. So how do we remember Elizabeth II? Because she is in our most recent memory, unlike the other queens I'll discuss in this series. Elizabeth was memorialised first as the young woman coming to the throne in a blaze of glory and optimism. Then as a woman devoted to duty. And finally as the nation's grandmother, in bright colours equipped with an ever-present handbag. She was celebrated and admired as a symbol of stoicism and national duty when she sat alone at the funeral of her husband and consort, Prince Philip, in 2021. When she died in 2022, at the age of 96, she was one of the last people alive who could remember serving in World War II. She had lived through 3/4 of the entire 20th century and seen the world change beyond measure, particularly for women. To think that when she was born, World War I had not been over for 10 years. It was the age of the flapper, and not all women had the vote. And the most important act passed in her reign in terms of monarchy was in 2013, when Britain finally caught up with the rest of Europe and said the eldest child would inherit the throne, no matter whether male or female. And that totally changed, because previous to that, it was always the boy. Even if there had been 5 or 6 elder sisters, if there was a boy, even if he was a baby, he'd get the throne. And finally, the idea that women can inherit the throne equally reflected, I think, how much Elizabeth had proved that a woman could do the job just as well as a man, and in what was so often for her, a man's world. As Elizabeth II once said of her duty to be in the public eye, "I have to be seen to be believed." She was right. The final act of the Queen was to be photographed in Balmoral, meeting the new Prime Minister. She passed away 2 days later. If there had been no photograph, it may be that people wouldn't have believed she was still working right up until the end. If Elizabeth I was the Queen of portraiture, Victoria of photography, then Elizabeth II was the monarch of television. She was, I would argue, the high point of monarchy. We will never see the like again.